to stay competitive as a leader within this digital world and now this age of AI, you need to be investing at a minimum 5 hours per week in ongoing learning, development, education, upwards to 10 hours per week.
The Digital Banking Podcast is powered by Typhon. Typhon is the creator of Infinia, a dramatically better digital banking platform for community financial institutions, as well as several platform-agnostic, revenue-generating point solutions. Our highly configurable platform and broad ecosystem of third-party partners ensure our entire suite is scalable and extensible to meet the needs of any FI. On our podcast, you will hear host Josh DeTar discuss today's most pressing financial technology topics with seasoned industry experts from every possible discipline.
You know, your podcast hasn't officially made it until there's ads in it. But this is one you're not going to want to skip past. And, well, if you do, feel free to hit that fast forward 15 seconds button twice. Ever wonder what gives me my energy and enthusiasm during these podcasts? You know, outside of my relentless desire to learn about, connect, share, and build up community FIs and their mission to support the communities they serve? It's coffee, and lots of it. Now, you want to know what's better than your regular old coffee? How about donating $5 to the Children's Miracle Network hospitals through Credit Unions for Kids every time you purchase high-quality, ethically sourced coffee that also provides living wages to coffee farmers. So if you want to listen to this episode with epic levels of caffeine-induced focus and help kids in need, head to javaforkids.org to learn more and buy a bag or 10. Thanks.
Welcome to another episode of the Digital Banking Podcast. My guest today is DeTar Lay, the founder and CEO of the Digital Growth Institute. Stoked is an understatement for today's guest. I figured stoked is a solid word choice for JR, as hopefully he'll tell us a little bit about his days in a punk rock band with giant Liberty spikes for hair. Here's why, though. I've been following him on social media and reading his email newsletter and books for quite some time. And JR is not shy of the tough subjects, to the extent that when I asked him to tell me about himself, he said his North Star of life is death. Which, as you can imagine, really piqued my interest. Death? Why death? But his response really resonated deeply with me. He said, we all have a finite amount of time in this experience. How will you use it? Will you let your own self-limiting beliefs and fears hold you back from doing something powerful and good? Or will you seize the opportunity? He said it was becoming a father of now 4 amazing kids. Put this perspective so squarely in his focus. Not only do I want to make the most of my time, I want to set an example and path for my children to do the same. Now, I'm going to let JR walk us through some of his incredible life's progression and how he ended up being a voice for change for community financial institutions. But suffice it to say, if you want to keep doing what you have always done, how you have always done it, with the expectation that the world will just keep turning exactly how it always has, you may not want to hear some of the things he has to say today. Although I'd argue you probably really should. JR, what's going on, man? Glad to have you on the show.
Josh, thanks so much for having me, man. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
I know, me too. You know, it's funny when I was kind of prepping for today, I don't know about you, right? But podcasts has become one of my favorite parts of my quote job, but it is also a lot of work, right? And it's kind of like mentally exhausting prep. You got to go through all of this. But I've been really jazzed about this all day, like knowing that this was coming. And I think part of it is because, like I said, you know, I follow you on social media and things. And one of the things that I really appreciate about you is that you take a lot of times a very provocative stance on things. You're willing to have kind of the edgy subjects, but it always comes from a positive place. Like, even when you're talking about really negative subject matter, you always find a way to put it in a light where it's like, hey, but here's the positive side of that, right? I really value that. I like seeing that in my social media feed as opposed to a lot of the stuff that I see. You know what I mean?
How you perceive the present moment is a lot of times based upon a past experience. And we associate an emotion many times with a past experience, positive or negative, if you will. In fact, the human mind has about 60,000 thoughts per day, and about 85% of those thoughts tend to be more on the negative side.
Hmm.
And if that is what is remunerating in our mind, if that is our perspective, particularly if we're starting to think about the future, we must be very mindful of the thoughts, because what we focus on will expand. And we're starting to quantify that. We've been running what's called the Future Growth Index with financial brands, their leadership teams, their boards of directors, to gain an objective perspective into how they perceive the future. Are they looking at it through a lens of hope, abundance, optimism? Or perhaps are they looking at the future through a lens of fear and scarcity, uncertainty, and doubt? And what we're actually finding is they're trending towards that fear, scarcity, uncertainty, doubt side of things. We've been running the same exact study, though, from an entrepreneurial lens, a B2B entrepreneurial lens, for compare and contrast. B2B entrepreneurs, on the flip side of the equation, are very hopeful. They're very optimistic about the future, even in uncertain and chaotic times like we're in right now.
Well, I think, yes, that's super interesting. But I also think the entrepreneurial mindset is also a very interesting mindset. And I think that's such a perfect segue. I don't know if you intended to do this, but that's perfect segue to, it'd be really interesting to have you kind of talk through how you became an entrepreneur, right? Starting with being in a punk rock band and then getting told by probably someone you would say now is one of the most amazing women on the planet, right? That your band sucked.
You know, it's an important date today. It's, as of recording, it's the 23rd anniversary of the business.
That's super cool.
And
congratulations.
The business is, thank you very much. And the business has gone through a lot of evolutions over time, over the past 23 years. Some intentional, some unintentional, some forced, some done through just my own will and agency. But if we go back 23 years ago, I was just a sophomore in college. I was playing in a punk rock band. I was waiting tables. And this girl and I, who I had actually known since we were 14 years old, we were in a freshman English class in high school, AP English. It was Miss Bungo's class. We were not high school sweethearts at all. Like, there was a girl that sat in front of me that introduced us, who happened to be her neighbor. And I had a crush on this girl's neighbor through my entire high school career. And we ended up in college together, another freshman English class. And I liked this girl. Like, she was just a cool chick, and something was different about her. So we started hanging out, and I had this band, and she would come to my shows. And one day we were sitting in the library. She said, "Your band sucked. You just need to do something meaningful with your life." And that's all I needed to hear. And I quit my band that day. I went down to the courthouse. I got a DBA, started a web design company back in 2002 when the internet was still in its infancy, in hindsight. And as they say, kind of the rest is history. That girl and I would get married 4 years later, go on, start a family, and we've been on the highest highs, and we've been on the lowest lows. But you're right about the entrepreneurial mind. For me, it's transforming what many would perceive as failure along the way into just lessons. It's just tuition. It's just something to get to the next peak.
Yeah, well, I think, and kind of back to the data that you were finding, right? If you're in a well-established industry, and I'm completely projecting without the data to support this, right? You can tell me if your data supports this, you found it. I would think that you would gravitate more towards the fear of that being disintermediated versus being on the entrepreneurial side. You are excited about the opportunity of potentially disrupting someone who's sitting at the other side of that table going, "We're fine. We don't need to do anything different, but I'm afraid of the future and what could disrupt." I don't know.
It's a fair analysis. For me as an entrepreneur, I don't look at things through a lens of disruption, because that's a very negative context. Disruption, destroying. I look at this through, I would say, more of a what I perceive as a positive lens, which is just transformation. It's just the next step. It's just the next evolution. It's the next progression to pay homage and honor to what got us here, but what got us here isn't going to get us there to climb that next peak. I think, looking at where we are today as an industry, if we go back to 1994, which is such an inflection point because that was the year that the internet reached the mass consciousness of humanity. We had about 15,000 credit unions and about 15,000 community banks when the internet was just coming out. But if we go back, and we look at the passage of time through a digital anthropological point of view, we have these points, like July 5th, 1994. That was the day that Bezos would transform the way we shop online. May 18th, 1995 was the day that Wells Fargo would begin to transform how we bank when launching the very first online banking platform. We look at 1997, Netflix begins to transform how we get our media. But if you think about the story of Netflix, they have gone through 3 transformations themselves very intentionally. Because in 2007, which was the same exact year that Bezos launches the iPhone, Netflix begins to shift the model from DVD delivery to streaming. And when you go back and you read the headlines of Netflix in 2007 making this shift, they upset a lot of people because change is hard. I think one of the lessons I've learned from my mom is that the only person on planet Earth that likes change, really loves change, is a baby with a dirty diaper. In the Netflix in 2013, so 97 to 2007, that's 10 years, 2007 to 2013. Now that's 6 years. So half the time. They made another transformation of the model when they released their very first made for Netflix production, which was House of Cards. And now today, Netflix, we know them as they're a media platform. So that's just one example of an organization that has continuously, you could argue one of 2 ways, disrupted themselves or they transformed themselves as technology has progressed and as people behavior, because of the progression of technology, as people behavior has progressed as well.
That makes a lot of sense. No, that's a good perspective. I mean, going back to the statement I made about, entrepreneurs thinking, hey, I have the opportunity to disrupt. I think more my point is their mindset is more of a building mindset, right? Mm-hmm. Than a protecting mindset. And so as somebody who is creating something new, whether it's to transform an existing industry or whatever, you're still the person that's saying, I'm going to be the catalyst I'm going to start this thing to go build this thing or go after this.
Yeah, but what are we protecting? Because that's a belief, right? And if we look at the objective data, and in 1994 with the internet, 15,000 credit unions, 15,000 community banks, 2011, 2012, that number had been cut in half. So almost 20 years later, we're about down to 8,000 credit unions, 8,000 community banks. And in 2023, which is an important point of time, because in 2023, the ChatGPT had been launched like 2 months before. We're down to about 5,000 credit unions and community banks, about 10,000 total. So, and that's, I do bring a contrarian perspective, but we got to ask the hard questions if we're going to get to the next level. Because are you playing a game to win? Or are you playing a game not to lose? Because I think if all you're playing is defense and you're not at least attempting some level of an offensive posture, you can play defense all day long, but eventually you're going to have to score a point.
Yeah.
Because you got to put points on the scoreboard to win a game. You can't play defense the entire time. You can't protect the entire time.
And so that's what your data was kind of showing you is in the conversations with leadership level of community financial institutions, really defensive posture, right? Like we're trying to defend what we have, stay the status quo versus points on the scoreboard.
Yes. And I get it. And I'm very empathetic to that perspective, because that behavior is being driven by a belief system. And this was the whole premise of writing Banking on Change. Because if we're not mindful of our minds which I do believe is the most important technology that we have to master in the age of AI. It is our minds. Our brain is a biological computer. Our mind is software, essentially. What do we do every so often on our phones when we plug them in at night? iOS updates or your Android updates. You get an upgrade. And you can have the best technology. Technology is going to be continuously upgrading at an exponential rate that we can't even perceive right now. And if we're not upgrading our minds, i.e., upgrading our perspectives, and we're playing the game from a perspective rooted in 1999 or 2009 for that matter, the speed of change is beyond our comprehension. And once again, I've been studying this now for 23 years at the intersection of marketing, sales, technology, and most, I think, importantly, human behavior. Because you've got the internal perspective of digital transformation. You got the external of digital adoption and digital behaviors in the context of banking. But it's that internal perspective. Human transformation has to coincide with digital transformation to gain the greatest benefit and value from digital transformation.
I think, I kind of use the example for my own simple brain of if I take, Lewis Hamilton's Formula One winning car and I put myself in it, I'm not winning the Monaco Grand Prix. I got all the tech in the world. I got the car. I don't know how to drive this thing, man.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to have the mindset and the tools to be able to leverage all of this stuff. So yeah, all these advancements in AI is wonderful. But if you don't actually change the strategy of how you incorporate it into your thinking, into your business model, into how you actually do things, then it's useless. It's just technology on the sideline.
You bring up a very important point about you could have the best car. And I love the analogy of Lewis Hamilton. My son's a big F1 fanatic. And the amount of training and development that these drivers go through and continue to go through to perform at the level they perform, I don't think we can gloss over, especially when we're thinking about digital transformation and human transformation in financial services. Because when I was writing Banking on Change, one of the points of research that we did was around ongoing learning and ongoing education. And we found that the average financial brand leader is investing around 1 to 2 hours. It's about a 70 to 80%. I don't have the data right in front of me, but it's about 70 to 80% of financial brand leaders invest, and I use the word invest specifically, only 1 to 2 hours per week in their ongoing learning, development, education. Our secondary market research coming out of Silicon Valley says, no. To stay competitive as a leader within this digital world and now this age of AI, you need to be investing at a minimum 5 hours per week in ongoing learning, development, education, upwards to 10 hours per week. And so whenever I bring this into leadership teams and boards, they look at me like, well, what are you talking about? Like, I don't even have time for 1 to 2 hours a week. You're asking me to double that, to 5x that? And then my question is, well, how important is that to you going forward into the future? Because the rate of change is going to require us, and this was something from a futurist that wrote back in 1970s, Alvin Tolford, I believe. He said that the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write. It'll be those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn.
That's cool. I like that. Yeah, I mean, I didn't intentionally use F1 as an example, thinking all the way through the granularity of the example. But to that point, you think about those guys, right? And it's not just about the driver or the car. The car, I mean, think about the things that they are evolving in the car every single year. They're like, can we get 0.2% more downforce with, a 0.1% reduction in drag? And that minor detail or change could have a massive impact on their ability to win races. So the technology is having to change. And sometimes it's really, really small changes. Sometimes it's major changes.
Mm-hmm.
And then within the drivers, right? The drivers have to then be able to use that extra downforce. They've got to be able to say, well, I can take turn one now an extra 3 miles per hour. So where's my turn in point now with an extra 3 miles per hour versus where it was before? And if they just say, hey, you know what? I'm going to run the same race I ran last year as if the car was the exact same that it was last year, then they're not maximizing the potential of the car anymore, right? So all of these things have to be up leveling kind of harmoniously. And that takes dedication, that takes work, it takes effort. And I argue that once you get into the elite levels too, it is even less about the massive changes, right? It's like we're going from having a car with square wheels to one with round wheels. Like we're improving our downforce by 0.2%, right? When you get to that elite level, and when we get to the point where we're having to compete on such an incredible scale, it's going to be those little tiny things that we've got to improve on that are going to make big impacts.
And you're making a fantastic point about the car, about the driver, about the tech. But then let's take that to a bigger level. There's also the team now that is surrounding and supporting the driver, the car, and the tech, because that team, that driver, they're all working towards a unified vision, a purpose that's greater than the present moment. And it's ultimately, it's to win, which comes back to the point of like, are you protecting, playing defense, or are you playing the game to win? And when we're talking digital, these micro improvements over an extended period of time, they begin to compound, and that creates exponential value beyond of what we can perceive today. Because you're thinking, well, what good is 1% today? We'll do 1%, be 1% better every day over the course of the next 365 days, and you have grown exponentially as a human being, for that matter, as a team, as an organization.
Yeah, I like that you bring the team into it, because if we think about, let's even just use the direct correlation to digital banking for a community financial institution. So let's say you go out and buy the best platform, however you decide you want to quantify that. So now you have the best F1 car of all the cars. And then your driver doesn't know how to drive it. Your leader at your institution isn't prepared with a strategy to capitalize on all these bells and whistles that you have. Okay, now let's say you've got both of those things solved. You have a visionary CEO who's not afraid of change, who's willing to take chances and risks, and is willing to push the envelope with technology. You get the best technology. And then your team that runs it doesn't support it, doesn't believe it. That's like having your pit crew thinking, oh, you know what? This is just another day at the office. I worked at Jiffy Lube last week and I rotate tires. And so when this guy pulls into the pit, we got a minute, we'll get the tires changed and we'll take a peek at the brakes, make sure they're good. Right. Versus a team that understands the mission is, hey, we are, 0.2 behind the leader. If we can get our pit stop 0.3 faster, we put our guy 1/10 ahead.
You said a key word that I want to roll back to about the leader. You said the word vision, and I've written about vision in both banking on digital growth as well as banking on change, because there's some ancient wisdom here. Where there is no vision, the people perish. And if the vision is more of the same of what it has been, playing that game of defense and protecting what we know, then the people will perish. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow. The vision, and one of my mentors over the years, Dan Sullivan, really changed my whole perspective about the future. He said, JR, you always have to make your future bigger than your past. Because if the past becomes bigger than the future, what's the motivating factor at that point? Yeah. And so vision is key when it comes to this next level of growth that I do feel hopeful and inspired for community institutions, because it does come back to the people. This is still a very people-centric business. Financial stress is getting worse for people. It's not getting any better. But then the question is are we still just operating based upon loans and deposits, or could we really ask ourselves the hard question is why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we adopting this new technology? What is the opportunity to help other people get beyond the pains that they're experiencing today and provide them a path, provide them hope to a bigger future?
I think this is why I love doing this podcast so much. And I think I can probably put words in your mouth and say it's why you like doing it too, is being able to have these kinds of conversations. Because it's not like this is stuff that we don't necessarily know, right? And I always find it really interesting when somebody says something kind of really that hits me at my core, but it's so simple. And so when you say something like, a great piece of advice is just, your future should always be bigger than your past. When you say that, you're like, yeah, no, duh. But I never said, I never actually said that. I never vocalized that. I never operationalized that. And I think that this industry is such an incredibly important industry to the health and lives of our American, fellow Americans. And being able to provide financial stability and security, that's a pretty cool thing. And that's being done by these community financial institutions. So that's why I think people like you and I get so fired up about this stuff, and why we're willing to get so passionate about it is the opportunity is colossal. And it's not just opportunity for them to grow their business, right? It's opportunity for them to do more of the amazing good work that they do in people's lives and the impacts that they have on allowing them to live more free. Because let's face it, being financially free is incredibly freeing for people.
It is. And that passion and that purpose for me is why I've done what I've done, because I do believe that this is a noble cause. This is a noble industry. This has the ability. It's like healthcare. There's such a strong correlation between a person's financial well-being and their physical well-being. The data, it's just becoming more and more obvious. But whenever I ask, and we do diagnostic work with leadership teams and boards, and I ask them, and we survey, well, why should I open an account? Why should I apply for a loan at your institution? And the common patterns come back around, well, we have great rates and we have amazing service and we've got these awesome products. And I wrote about this in Banking on Digital Growth, and you start to like, what if everyone's saying the same thing? You know what is missing in these responses that I think is going to be so critically important in this age of AI where commoditization is happening at a much faster rate? We have knowledge, we have wisdom, we have expertise, we have empathy. We have all of these human characteristics and traits. Oh, and by the way, we've got this amazing kick-ass technology too. But we have this humanity of being able to meet people where they're at, ask, listen, hear their questions, hear their concerns, provide a path towards a future, and then give them the coaching and the accountability that they need to get to that future. It's like, I've been beating up on financial literacy now for probably about 5 years. Financial literacy, financial wellness, financial education, whatever you want to call that thing. And I'm like, that's fantastic. We've taken the first step, but we need to layer on some sort of coaching mechanism to the education, because knowledge alone is not going to change behavior.
Correct.
It's like you've got data at the lowest level, which is ones and zeros, and you got knowledge how to interpret that data. At the highest level, though, is wisdom, and it's being able to apply that. And so just like I'm talking about this need for education externally combined with coaching to help people transform their beliefs and behaviors around money to improve their and achieve financial freedom, back to your point, the same is true internally. Just because you gain a new perspective, and I wrote about this in Banking on Change, there are 4 steps that lead to human transformation. The first step is to see things from a different angle, from a different perspective. And maybe someone who is watching or listening to our conversation here, perhaps they're thinking and seeing things differently, because the follow to seeing something different is you're going to begin to think different. Your thought patterns begin to change. Like, it's very hard to unsee what you have seen. And then the last piece of this is when you go to, what's the third step? And I'm curious, Josh, when you begin to see different, when you begin to think different, what's the next step?
Sort of act different.
And that's so interesting. And that's the belief of 98, 99% of leaders that I've worked with over the years. And I've asked this question thousands of times. And my question then is, are you really going to act different because you're thinking different? Because how many of us, and I'll be the first one to step in front of the line, that says, I know there are things that I need to do different in my life, whether that be personally or professionally, or probably a blend of both. But I am failing to take action.
Just because you
for
think
one
it.
reason. Yeah. Because there's a fourth step that sits between the thought and the action. And that's the feeling and the emotion. We have to reach a point as leaders to where our feeling, our emotion to do, to act, to be different is greater, and in many cases exponentially greater than the feeling and the emotion to maintain the status quo. And more times than not, understanding human behavior is that emotion to take action is going to be rooted in some sort of pain, because we're more likely to take action to avoid pain and loss than we are to achieve some sort of gain.
Yeah.
Basic behavioral economics. Therefore, what are we looking at when it comes to the transformations that we need to make as an organization to continue to achieve digital transformation? What are the potential pains, the pitfalls, the roadblocks that we might not be aware of, that we might not even be see right now, just because we don't have the knowledge, the perspective? But at the same time, we have to be very careful that if we're operating based upon feeling alone, that too can be a very dangerous place. Because, for example, you might go to a conference, and I see this all the time. And I'm starting to speak out about this. Like, great, you're at this conference. I'm doing like a closing keynote or something. You're going to go home and you're going to be fired up, and you're going to come back and you give all these great ideas to everyone else on your team. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
Probably nothing. It's going to be more of the same, because you're operating from a state of heightened emotion. But that feeling, that's a temporary, it's inspiration. And inspiration, it's like a light or a candle. It's eventually going to dim out over time. Motivation is like a muscle. It's going to eventually fatigue over time. So to bridge that gap between the thought and the action, yeah, it's feeling an emotion, but there's got to be another guard in there, so that we don't, once we are now demotivated because we're back at the office and no one is seeing what we're seeing, because we were the ones who went to the conference, we were the one who went to the event, we were the ones who got fired up. The safeguard there is coaching. Just like the coaching is an external component, there's got to be an internal component of coaching too. The question is, are you willing to go to this level of vulnerability to get real and to get open, to get honest with yourself and with your team? Because I think it's the guards that keep people back.
As you were talking about that just, it really kind of harkened back to, I think we were even just talking about physical health and financial health.
Yeah.
That's so true in both of those areas too, right? I know that I should probably eat a little bit healthy. I know that I should probably exercise. So I'm going to think different. But how many of us actually act on it? Same thing. I know I probably should stop spending so much money on stupid trinkets on Amazon. Do I actually act on it? Right? And it's really creating that, like you said, kind of those foundational pillars that'll actually be the element of change, that'll actually get you to the stage of action that's going to separate whether you make it there or not. So this actually brings up something interesting that I really wanted you to talk a little bit about. You've referenced a few times the books, but we haven't actually really talked about them. So, you have 2 books out, Banking on Digital Growth and Banking on Change, that, you will be the first one to admit. You're like, hey, I wrote Banking on Digital Growth, almost 5 years ago now it came out?
Yep.
So almost 5 years ago. And when you published that, right, you were like, this is the best piece of work that has ever been published. This encompasses all of my knowledge at this time. And now you look back on it and you're like, that was wrong. That was wrong. I mean, that's still foundationally right, but I would change that. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to me a little bit about even just your own self-reflection of, I mean, you were willing to put this stuff on paper, put your name and picture on it and put it online for people to pay their hard-earned money for. And then you're like, hey, I had to write another one because some things have changed. And being able to have that self-awareness and admit that, and then take evolution of action on those changes. Talk through that process.
I'm very honest with my kids when I say this, but I'm right until I'm proven wrong. And I'm willing to fall on my own sword. I'm right until I'm proven wrong because there's been a new data set that I can take and digest and reflect on. Because when I published Banking on Digital Growth, it was supposed to have been published in March of 2020. It's 5 years now. And we had no idea what was going to happen when we were getting ready to go to market with that book. I was super stoked. You used the word earlier. I was super stoked and I was excited. I'd been working on this thing for about 18 months and had this huge keynote speaking tour lined up around the world. And then right around that time, COVID happened and shut everything down. And it was almost like it was a curse and a blessing. And this is where like having a positive perspective comes back into play, because when everything shut down, I remember I got the first email saying we canceled our conference, and then it was just like a waterfall. It was like canceled. I was like, oh, this sucks. And I fell into the gap. I was griping about problems for about a week until my wife, again, she pulls out that brutal, harsh truth. She says, gives me some choice words that are not appropriate to share on this podcast, but it was the truth. That then led me to launch the podcast. And it was like, you take a negative experience and you're able to transform that into a positive one. Because had COVID ever happened, I don't think I probably would have launched the podcast. And now I've done almost 500 episodes. So like you, it's like, I love this because you're always learning and gaining perspective here. And maybe we'll loop back on that point because I think this is the next step. And so in reflection, whenever I wrote Banking on Digital Growth, I realized I made a huge error. Like so much so I had to freaking write another book to like condone, like, make up for my sins. and the error it was the heart of Banking on Digital Growth. I presented a formulaic approach to growth where DX plus HX equals growth, meaning a positive digital experience when combined with a positive human experience, it is the path to growth. And then COVID happened. And I was observing what was going on in the market and with clients. And I said, you know what? I missed the most important element, if you will, in this formula, and that's the employee experience. And so when I started to go back and reflect on where does the employee experience fit within this context of growth? Because we're talking about a digital experience and we're talking about a human experience when it comes to customers or members. Everything starts with the employee experience. All change, all transformation that leads to future growth, it starts within. It starts with the individual. It starts with the self. You transform yourself, you transform your teams. Teams are made up of individuals. You transform your teams, you transform your organization. You transform your organization, you continue to transform the lives of your customers and members. And you do that enough, you transform other people in your communities. But I reflected and I was like, we got to start figuring out what it's going to take to inspire transformation of people. And that was the context of Banking on Change. It was going deeper into the human experience. To now we look at this from a formulaic approach where EX plus HX in parentheses, meaning a positive experience leads to a positive human experience, can then be multiplied exponentially by DX. So your digital experience becomes the exponential multiplier of the employee and the human experience delivered in just a different channel, a different context.
One of the other things that I thought was interesting is you were talking about as you kind of had that self-reflection through the pandemic. And I mean, it's always interesting to see how people react to massive catalysts of change, right? There's always, to your point, like there's always a kind of a microcosm of things that are causing us to have to do changes. And, it could be anything from, well, it's probably a hot topic right now, but, maybe a new CFPB rule or something like that. And that may seem like a really big change in the moment, but I would argue in comparison to like what the pandemic did to us, right? It pales. And so there's going to be these moments where we are kind of kicked into the pool of change. And we're like, hey, but you got no option other than to figure it out because change is here and it is unavoidable. But to your point, what do you do with that new knowledge? What do you do with that change? And how does that impact your future and your future strategy and your thought process on the world and things? And, for you had the realization like, oh, I missed a key element in that first, right? I missed that employee experience element, or just kind of how that rounded out the human experience of someone interacting with a financial institution. What do you think were some of the things that you saw as light bulb moments for leaders at financial institutions? And conversely, what are some of the things that you saw people do in response that they've then come back on over time?
I think COVID allowed for the greatest amount of innovation and quote unquote progress in financial services that we have seen maybe ever in the shortest amount of time.
Yeah.
And I remember early on, I was talking to my wife. I said, listen, I talked about this early on the podcast too, back in 2020. I said, give it 3 or 4 years. And all of this, the pendulum's going to swing. We're going to go back. Leaders are going to go back to the way things were before. Once we're in the clear, once we're out of the danger zone, once we're back to the status quo. And that's exactly what I have observed probably end of 2023 going to 2024. The progress began to slow, the focus began to shift, the speed at which changes were happening slowed. And I think a lot of it was the fatigue, the fatigue of speed. It's like running. COVID was a sprint. You can only sprint for so long before you are going to tire out. It's one of the reasons I always recommend that when you're talking about change and transformation, think of it as like a marathon. And you're going to have to train for that. I've run a couple of marathons myself, and you don't get up one day and think, oh, I'm going to go run 26.2. No, you have a training plan, and you follow the plan, and you build up your endurance over time, and then it becomes race time. And you go and run the race, and you might have the best training plan. You might feel like you're prepped. And this has actually happened to me a couple times. It's like you go out on race day, temperature's off, too much humidity. It's not cool enough in the morning. So you have to adjust your plan in real time. And that's an opportunity that I see going forward for institutions, is to think about the quote unquote annual planning event. Take this down to 90-day planning cycles, planning and execution cycles. Think about this on a quarterly basis, because so much can change as we are observing now, particularly with all the releases happening around AI. It's like November 30th, 2022 was when ChatGPT hit the market. And I get it. The idea of exponentiality is very hard to wrap your mind around, particularly because me included, we're all like feeble linear thinkers. But if you think about this, it's like Uber came out in 2008, a year after 2008, 2009. I think Airbnb came out in 2008. Uber came out in 2009. So it was a year after the iPhone released. And it took Uber almost 6 years to go from 0 to 100 million users. Take Instagram. It took Instagram 30 months, 2.5 years to go from 0 to 100 million users. It took TikTok 9 months to go from 0 to 100 million users. When ChatGPT came out, November 30th, 2022, it took 2 months to go from 0 to 100 million users. Like, that's an exponential adoption curve of watching and observing human behavior. Yet I was just doing a keynote at a industry event a bunch of associations, state associations came together, CEOs and boards. And I asked the group, I was like, there's hundreds of them. I said, what, how many of you have experimented with some sort of AI model? Most well known would be ChatGPT. 80%, 85% have not yet.
It's crazy.
And we're 2.5 years in on this thing.
Yeah.
And then what I'm observing is their behavior with these models, and for example, ChatGPT, they're Googling ChatGPT. And I'm not calling anyone out. I get it. I understand. I do a lot of coaching around it. I'm very empathetic. But this is where the belief system has to change. And so I'm like, listen, the very first time you Googled was probably in going to your 8th grade dance. It's like everyone thought they knew what they were doing, but no one has a freaking clue of what they were doing. That's where we're at with AI right now. We're like at the 8th grade dance stage. It's like everyone thinks they know what they're doing, but we're all learning together with this. But you gotta get back in the game.
Yeah.
You just got to get in the game and learn through the experiences and be willing to say and to use the Socratic approach to wisdom, where Socrates defined wisdom as I know nothing.
I want to come back to AI, but you were talking about something that I think is really worth going back to for a minute.
Sure.
And you talked about kind of the fatigue of the speed of change.
Mm.
And I remember in the early days of the pandemic, and I remember talking to a good friend who's a CEO of a good size, and he talked about one of the realizations that he had about his organization in the early stages of the pandemic. And granted, this is a fairly, low-hanging fruit example, but I think it makes a couple of points back to what you were talking about. He said that prior to the pandemic, JR, they were trying to institute the ability for some of their key employees to work from home. And he was like, I'm not even joking you. We were a year into this. And each time we got, okay, IT has figured out how to do it technically. HR was like, oh, but we have this problem here in this policy. And then HR finally gets it figured out. And then IT is like, oh, no, there's something over here. And then all of a sudden, Oops is coming in over here. And it's like, oh, we can't for this reason. And he's like, the pandemic hit. We did it in 1 week. He's like, we got everybody together. We figured it out. We made a decision. We committed. We executed. And in 1 week, we had a work from home policy, the tools for people to do it. And it worked just fine. And he was like, so what that told me was we spent a year doing something that we should have done in a week. What I think would be really interesting is I'm going to probably call him right after this episode ends and ask him, hey, I'm just curious. What does that look like today? Are you still finding that there are things that take you a year to do that you could have done in a week? Or conversely, did you maybe find out, technically we could have done it in a week, burnt my people out. And we did it because it was a special necessity. And is there a pace of change that, to your point, like we're trying to sprint the first mile of the marathon and then realizing, oh crap, we're gassed out, man. This was a bad idea. Or have you figured out that there's maybe an in-between and maybe, you sprinted to get your work from home policy because you knew you needed to, like you were being chased by a bear. And maybe you realized that a lot of the things that were happening in your institution, you were walking that marathon when you probably could have jogged at least. I'd be really curious to find out what he has found in that kind of pace change post that lesson learned for him has been. I don't know. I'd be really curious to see what that looks like.
It would be very interesting because one of the things that I shared as a strategic model in banking on change is that the 90-day growth method. And just like there are 4 seasons, spring, summer, fall, winter, there are 4 seasons that we must cycle through as individuals, teams, and organizations. We learn in the spring, we think in the summer, we do and harvest in the fall, reap the fruits of our labor, and then in the winter, it's a great time to review and reflect on the progress that we've made over the previous year. Well, if you can compress those 4 seasons those 4 environments of learning, thinking, doing, and reviewing down to a 90-day cycle, you increase the speed at which you are going through a transformational initiative. Just like there's a gap in learning, season of learning that we were talking about before, there's also a gap in reflection and review, because so many leaders, they get stuck in the fall, reaping the fruits of the labor, just doing the work, not creating intentional space and time to review and to reflect on the progress we've made, on the lessons that we've learned, and how to apply that to our next iteration going forward. Because when we do create that space and time to review and reflect, that's some of the greatest education that we can get that no book, no podcast, no conference is going to give us. It's through our own reflection of our experiences. And in Banking on Change, I put forth a model where EQ plus AQ is going to be greater than IQ in the age of AI. I mean, we're already looking at the singularity and the theory that artificial intelligence is going to surpass human intelligence. And I kind of buy into that to a point. And then I said, okay, fine. Let the artificial intelligence surpass my intelligence. Like, that does not bother me, because I know that my EQ and my AQ is going to be greater than my IQ, to where my emotional intelligence and my ability to connect and be with people and meet them where they're at, when combined with my AQ, which is my adaptability quotient or my adaptability intelligence, that's a superpower that's going to allow us as people to differentiate ourselves from the machines. And the AQ is an area that I'm very concerned about in FinServe, with banks, with credit unions. Because when I work with these teams and organizations and I ask them, I said, okay, you want to increase your AQ? Yes, because AQ is like EQ. It can be benchmarked, it can be measured, and it can be coached and increased over time. You can increase your adaptability quotient. And so I asked these leadership teams and these boards, I'm like, so you want to do this, right? I said, yes. Tell me how to increase my AQ. Okay, I'll tell you. I'm not going to make you promise, because I think it's a little too strong right now. We just met each other, but you want to do this. When we wrap up here and you go back to your room tonight, I want you to take a cold shower, either tonight or in the morning. I want you to just ice cold, as cold as you can get it, and just stand in that cold water. And I promise you're going to increase your AQ, your adaptability quotient. And the amount of pushback and resistance I used to get upset from it, but I really try to take a stoic philosophy and just life in general. Like, why am I getting upset when people, they don't want to change? Why am I getting upset with people when they want to stay where they're at? That's their thing. But if you want to do this, your ability to adapt to environmental changes, the cold and the cold plunge, the cold therapy is scientifically proven, so that if another event like COVID happens, you're probably going to surf the waters instead of getting caught in the undertow.
It's funny when you were talking about, people going to conferences and things and hearing the motivational keynote and all of these things, and they get all rah, and then it fails to turn into action so many times. It's interesting you were talking about that. And I'm going to, maybe be a little overly transparent here. I go to a lot of these conferences. I hear a lot of these speakers. And so many times I sit back and just, how is this really, what you're doing is you're telling me all these wonderful things that you've done. What you're not telling me is how to make this applicable in my life. What are the use cases? What are the steps and tools that I can use to implement this? And what can I expect to see as my ROI for adapting to this, right? And so many times I hate to admit, a little bit of a pessimist in the back corner of a lot of these. And I was at one, this was probably about 2 years ago now, JR. Have you ever heard the guy that Iron Cowboy speak?
Yes.
That guy was awesome. Huge fan. Because what he did was he ended kind of each of his minor points and ended the whole thing with a major point, with tools that you could actually take home. And for those of you who have not heard him speak before, I'll surmise it to say a lot of what he's talking about is your ability to be resilient, right? And that you have to face challenges and adversity. And he kind of made a comment that has always stuck with me. He said, the hardest thing that you face in life is the hardest thing that you faced in life. So if the hardest thing you've ever faced in your life is someone said something mean to you on Twitter, it's a pretty low barometer. And it's not going to take a lot to rock your world. Right. And so I started thinking about that. And, for my wife and my wife is a young breast cancer. Right. And we went through that early in our marriage. And that was the hardest thing we'd ever been through. And what's funny is, now even my wife, we have a little bit of a dark sense of humor about it now, as you can probably imagine. But even just the other night, something was going on and it would have been a pretty challenging thing. And my wife looks at me, JR, and she goes, at least it's not as bad as having your what's chopped off. You got a fair point, babe. And so the point of that is that became her new barometer. She's like, hey, I've been through, like, somebody saying something mean to me on social media. She's like, I could not care less. That ain't going to faze me one iota. Right. And so what I took from that lesson from the Iron Cowboy was looking for other ways to, we're now 5+ years removed from her cancer journey. Right. That stuff starts to become fleeting. And you start to forget about, I got through that. And so you almost need to reintroduce new challenges, new things in your life that create adversity so that you are prepared for real adversity. And so actually, funny enough that you bring that up as the point, ever since then, I've started doing cryotherapy, right?
Yeah.
And if you haven't done it, I encourage it, man. Standing in there for 3 minutes at negative 230 degrees, it sucks. Tell everybody, I'm like, I get out of that cryo chamber and my first thought is, who's got a tiger? I want to fight that thing. Like,
You feel like a
hands.
badass.
You feel awesome.
And I'm so glad. And first and foremost, thanks for sharing that about you and your wife. I'm happy that she's healthy and y'all got to the other side of this thing. But it built resilience
Absolutely.
for her, for you together as a couple, to where what would have been some sort of like something to probably throw both of you off before, it's just water off your back. And there's a great book on this subject called The Comfort Crisis. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. There's some ancient wisdom, quote unquote, where we are in a cycle of time. There was a book that came out in 1997 called The Fourth Turning. And it was very prophetic to the world that we're in right now. And I guess that's one of the reasons I can sit where I sit, be fairly calm, be very hopeful, be very optimistic, not let a lot rattle me right now. Because what the fourth turning looks at is the world works in 80-year cycles, more or less, that these authors identified back then. And we are in a season of winter. And what gives me hope is what comes after winter. It's spring. If you think about where we were last year in 2024, we go back 80 years before, it was 1944. That was the year we were at the pinnacle of World War II. We dropped the bomb. Pretty dark time in hindsight. We go back 80 years before that, 1944 to 1864. We're in the Civil War. If we go back 80 years before that, 1774, right at the start of the American Revolution. And if we're aware of these cycles of time, of these ebbs and flows, we can use that knowledge and that wisdom to our advantage as leaders to build upon that and to be mindful and to be aware that we just don't get sucked down by the challenges and the complexities that I think many are feeling right now. And if you're not doing hard things and intentionally putting yourself, for example, you talk about cryotherapy. I have a cold plunge on my back porch that's set at 37, 38 degrees. I hop in there for 2 minutes. It doesn't get any easier, but it builds your mental resiliency.
Yep.
Otherwise, you risk, as I wrote about in Banking on Change, you risk getting stuck in the cave of complacency.
Yep.
And the cave of complacency, it beckons all of us. It's like the sirens of the old mythology. It, calls us in to the safety of the warmth by the fire. But what we don't see in the cave of complacency are all of the bones scattered from others that have gone in there seeking solace from the storm of life. They never made it out. They got comfortable and they ended up dying in there. And it's like the opportunity is to come out of that cave, keep climbing that mountain. And as you talk about going to these conferences and you're there listening to the speakers, and I'm there doing the keynote speaking thing, I'm not going to lie. I have had a lot of personal conflict of why the hell am I doing what I'm doing if no one is going to take any action on this?
Yeah.
Because if nothing changes, nothing changes.
Yeah. No, it's we need those catalysts for change, but we also need the ability to respond to change, right? And that comes back to your adaptability score. And I think that goes to, I've overused this analogy, so I apologize to anybody who's a faithful listener and has listened to every episode of the podcast, but it keeps coming up as an opportunity to use it as an example. And it's the biodome experiment, right? And when they first started the biodome, they couldn't grow trees and they couldn't figure out why. And the lesson is they realized that it was because there was no wind in the biodome. So the trees never faced adversity. They never developed the need to send down deep, strong roots and grow good foundations. And as soon as they got tall enough, they just fell over. All they had to do was introduce wind into the biodome and they grew trees, right? We humans, I think, are so much the same way. And when we get stuck in complacency and trying to create such a comfort zone for ourselves, we never grow, we never change, we never develop the strength to weather the storms. And yeah, I mean, going back to my wife and I's example, look, I want to be incredibly respectful of understanding that we had a very positive outcome from that so many others are not as blessed to have had, right? But with our experience and our outcome of it, people think that we're crazy sometimes when we say this. We're both glad we went through it. We aren't. Because like you said, it made her stronger. It made me stronger. It made us stronger as a couple. And my wife and I, we basically don't fight, man, because there's pretty much nothing that comes up where we're like, you know what? This little annoyance or this little thing that we've got to deal with, it's just not that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. You know what I mean? And so having those opportunities in life to look for the positive in it and say, I'm going to use this as a tool in my arsenal to be prepared to adapt, to be prepared to change, and to be prepared to pivot when the opportunity presents itself or is required of me. I'm going to be strong and resilient and able to face it. And that's such a powerful force that, like you were saying, I mean, we can apply in both our personal lives, but also our professional lives, right? If we stagnate in our professional lives, then you're not changing, you're not growing.
No, and it's the call. It's the call to action. And I if you're okay with it, I want to give everyone watching and listening a very practical tool, because I do think it's the tools that you can use to unlock your next level of growth, exponential growth, as I write about in Banking on Change. And you're touching on this, Josh. Exponential growth I define as when you are growing as an individual, both personally and professionally at the same exact time. Your personal growth can lead to your professional growth. Your professional growth can lead to your personal growth. Your personal stagnation can lead to your professional stagnation, and vice versa. And one of the tools that I want to just unpack is ideas for growth, IDEAS, because we've talked a lot, we've given a lot of different perspectives, and I really appreciate how you've guided this conversation, Josh. When we look at what we've discussed, get a piece of paper and write down 3 insights that you have gained. Don't overthink it. Just 3 insights that come top of your mind from what we've been talking about. And from there, I want you to decide. So the D, I want you to decide and circle what you believe the number 1 insight is for yourself. And then from there, I want to go to the E of ideas, and I want you to expand upon why you believe that this is the number 1 insight that you've gained from the conversation we've had. Because when you expand upon it and you give why, what you're doing is you're associating meaning with an insight. Because otherwise, if you just write down the insights and you circle the top 1 and we're done with the exercise, you have no meaning assigned to it. Then it's just data. But you have to give something meaning, because it's the meaning that's what's going to motivate you to do the next, which is the A. It's the actions. And so once you've assigned meaning to the top idea, to the top insight, I want you to write down the 3 actions that you're going to take next to turn this insight into action, to begin to move forward, to begin to make progress, to begin to create momentum. Not achieve it, but just to get something going. You can do this also at the end of a conference or an event, end of listening to any podcast. It's ideas for growth. But the most important piece of this, once you have your top 3 insights, once you've decided on what the number 1 is for you, once you've expanded upon it and given it meaning and said, why is this the top one for myself, for my team, for my organization? Once you've written down 3 actions that you can take to create some momentum, you got to share it. You got to go share what the insight is, why it's important, 3 actions that you're going to take next, because that's going to create some accountability. And confidence is the result of doing what you said you're going to do. And to me, when you get that accountability and you share this with someone else and they hold you accountable and check in, hey, did you do anything with this? Or did you just listen to this podcast and that was great, but you didn't do anything with it? Nothing changes. It's the accountability piece that is where the transformation happens, because it comes back to seeing and thinking and feeling different to then take action to do, be, act.
Well, I think you just wrote my LinkedIn post for when this podcast drops. So there we go. Before I let you go, man, I wanted to come back real quickly to the conversation we've been having. We've thrown the obnoxious buzzword AI out like 600 times in this, on conversation. But, I don't think we've really pulled together one of the things that we were talking about previously in this episode, which is when we're talking about AI, we're also talking about the entire context of this episode of just the rapid evolution of things. And are you prepared to adapt to those changes? And what are you with that? Right.
Mm-hmm.
To your point, right? I mean, there are actual immutable laws that govern the pace at which technology evolves and innovates. And it is not linear like the way that we have been thinking. And we were even joking about, some social media posts and things on AI before we started recording. And it's like, there's still an incredible misconception that these AI tools don't work very good or, don't have good use cases. And I would park one argument that we won't even touch, which is just that tells me you don't know how to use them in the first place. But 2, the pace at which these things are getting better, I agree, right? Like, we're still in so much of the infancy. Tomorrow, I'm not talking about like future state, and tomorrow is an example of it. I'm talking about literally February 12th. Tomorrow, it's going to be better. In February 13th, it's going to be even better than how much better it was from the 11th to the 12th. And that change, especially for my banker friends, think about it this way. It's like compounding of money. If you look at it tomorrow, it makes a little bit of a change. If you look at it 2 days from now, it makes a little bit of a change, maybe a little bit more. If you close your eyes, go to sleep, and wake up 10 years later and you look at it, it's changed a lot. Don't get caught in that changes a lot all of a sudden. That's my comment on AI. I'd love to get your perspective as kind of a closing take.
Well, I think that's a great word to wrap things up with. It's perspective. This entire conversation, the next evolution of financial services is going to be rooted in perspective. The next level of growth is going to be rooted in perspective. And one of the exercises that I use in my keynotes and my workshops is I ask a very uncomfortable question. I love seeing people squirm with this because it does make them uncomfortable. And I want to get people in an uncomfortable situation because growth never happens in the comfort zone, ever. You work out, you want to grow your muscles, you gotta get uncomfortable. And the question that I ask is this, is how old were you in 1994? Question for you, Josh. How old were you in 94?
8.
You were 8. I was 13. And I come back to this point because in 1994, that was the year the internet, as we were talking about before, reached the mass consciousness of people. And if you think about all of the changes that we've experienced over the last 30, 31 years since that moment in time, your experience as an 8-year-old was different than my experience as a 13-year-old, pretty close contextually speaking, because that is perspective is the sum of context and framing. But our experiences were vastly different than someone who was, say, 30 in 94. And what I like to do is not even let's talk about AI for a minute, because it's just the next evolution of technology.
Yeah.
What I want to do is completely go out of and provide a whole new perspective outside of our context, outside of our framing, and go all the way back to 1881, because that was 100 years before I was born. I was born in 1981. You were born in, I would assume, 87, 88. So let's go to 1881, and let's go from 1881 to 1925. So you got 43 years of time. You've got 43 years of perspective, context, and framing. And I want to look at two different angles with this. I want to look at transportation first. If you were born in 1881, you were just coming alive at the time that transportation was moving from horse and buggy to rail lines getting placed in your town. By the time that you were 19, about 20, 25 years old, the car, the automobile was now coming online. The Wright brothers were flying the very first airplane. So you now have early air travel. And if you look back to the Wright brothers, like, oh, that's not that great. They only flew for like 10, 12 seconds. Yet here we are taking things for granted when we get in our airplanes and we complain that we don't get Wi-Fi on a flight out to the conference or spot.
Perspective.
So 1881 to 1925, you've gone from horse and buggy to trains to automobiles to planes, because commercial flight is now really becoming a thing in the early to mid 20s. Still early on, but it's becoming an actual thing. Let's look at communication. If you're born in 1881, the primary mode of communication, you'd be writing letters. If you wanted to get it somewhere quick, Pony Express. But right around the time the rail lines were being laid, what was going up next to the rail lines? You had telegraph wire. Not telephone, telegraph.
Telegram, yeah.
And I think this is important because the modern day telegraph, we're still telegraphing. That's just texting.
That's true.
So we have to observe behavior in the context of time, which comes back to perspective. So you go from the telegraph to the telephone to the radio to the TV. But then from the time that the TV came out to really the next big progression, yes, you have computing power and whatnot of the 1960s and 70s, and computers get smaller and faster. And yes, you can talk about Moore's law and the doubling and whatnot. But it was the internet, though, that was the next big leap. But now here we are with this whole age of AI, and we've got this artificial intelligence. The other thing that I'm very interested in is another perspective of AI, which is authentic intelligence, because knowledge is getting commoditized with all of these large language models. What is not commoditized is the human experience. It's what we've done in this conversation today. It's like, Josh, you have an experience and I have an experience, and those who are watching and listening to this, they have an experience. And so you get this triangulation of 3 different perspectives. And we're able to do this asynchronously with someone watching or tuning in and listening.
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to walk away with a whole different perspective. That is going to be the next level when you combine the EQ and the AQ to see, think, feel different, to then act different, leaning into the authentic intelligence that each and every one of us has, that comes through our wisdom that we've gained through our lived, our learned, and our shared experiences.
Yeah, I agree. It's an exciting time to be alive. I mean, but I think every generation has probably said that, right? Because they all go through, to your exact point, right? There was the generation that never thought flying was going to be possible, that in their generation saw commercial air travel, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of us that are sitting there thinking that there's things that are impossible that are probably going to happen in our lifetime. And it's going to be interesting to see how those things come about.
And important for financial services, which is a conversation for another day, not just happen in our lifetime, but extend and expand our lifetime and our lifespan and our health span. Because that's going to make us really rethink this whole idea around money, finances, health, wealth, well-being. It is truly, Josh, an exciting time to be alive.
Well, I mean, this has been an absolute exciting podcast. I had a blast. I knew it would. Before I let you go, 2 final questions for you, sir. So where do you go to get information about what's happening in the industry? Any shout outs that you'd like to give?
I look out. Peter Zion, Peter Diamandis are 2 thinkers that I spend a lot of time studying with. I appreciate their perspective. I try to look outside of the industry a lot of times to gain a much broader context, a much broader perspective, because by studying different trends and patterns outside of the industry, we can begin to hypothesize what's going to happen inside the industry. Peter Zion, Peter Diamandis, Dan Sullivan over Strategic Coach. Those are 3 big thinkers that inspire my thinking.
I love it. Well, and if people want to connect with you or learn more about your work or find your books, or if I might be so bold, if you're an executive at a financial institution or board member and you want to be smart and get this dude to come out and talk to your leadership team, how can they connect with you and do that, man?
Send me a text, my cell phone, and it is my cell phone. It's 832-549-5792. Just send me a text, say hello. Happy to gift you a copy of Banking on Change. All you have to do is text me, or you can grab it off. You can spend $30 and grab it off of Amazon, but I can also gift you a digital copy as well and help guide you forward with that book.
I love it. Well, I appreciate all the insight. And like I said, if you don't already, please follow JR on social. Of all the stuff that I see, it's nice to see that kind of positive perspective a lot of times on it. And it's just a good way to start my morning. So follow him. And hey, thanks for taking your time to come and be on this digital banking podcast with me, sir.
Josh, thanks for having me, buddy.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Banking Podcast powered by Typho. Find more episodes on digitalbankingpodcast.com or subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your favorite podcasts.